Welcome to the GuideSpark series on the connected enterprise and the new work model. One of the goals here is for us to bring a variety of views and perspectives from leaders from a variety of different businesses, because I think in this crazy, uncertain times, we can learn a lot from a lot of different perspectives. So I'm really excited to have Mike Rood here joining us from Option Care Health. He's the SVP and CHRO there, and they are the largest infusion services company. I'll probably ask you to explain what that is here in a second.
That's fine.
But I think one of the key things is that you really support 50 states. And I think that's a really unique challenge for businesses. And so, tell us a little bit about yourself and Option Care Health.
Sure. Thanks, Keith, for having me, and look forward to our conversation. Option Care Health is the largest independent home infusion and alternative site healthcare services company. We are about 6,000 employees, about $3 billion in about a $12.5, $13 billion home infusion industry. We are licensed in all 50 states. We don't have facilities in all 50 states, but we can service just about 98% of the US population that requires infusion services. And it ranges from, the types of services we provide range from various acute and chronic therapies that require infusion therapy for folks. As more and more care is moving out of traditional healthcare locations, out of hospitals, moving to alternative sites, predominantly the home, where you get better quality of care, lower cost care, and in an environment where the patient is in a much better situation. We think that's the optimal solution for the future of home care, and more care is being delivered outside of traditional areas there. We have close to 3,000 clinicians within the organization, be it nurses, dietitians, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, and pharm techs, and they are really our frontline, the lifeblood of our caregiving folks. And who are on the front line day in and day out, all through this whole COVID pandemic, providing care to our patients. I've been in HR for over 30 years, have been with Option Care Health since we separated from Walgreens. The company used to be part of Walgreens, and in 2015, private equity acquired the company. I joined the company at that time, and then most recently, last August, we acquired BioScript, a competitor of ours, and added another third of the population and volume to the business. And overnight, it became a public company, and at that time became Option Care Health. So it's been a very interesting time. I'm sure other people that you've spoken to, Keith, have said the same thing. So I never knew that I would become a quasi-expert on how to deal with pandemic responses within an organization, but here you are in 2020, and that's what we're all dealing with right now.
Yeah, we're all learning lots of great new skills. I think one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we would clarify a little bit is, the variety of different roles and people you have. Certainly you have 3,000 clinicians, but I also think that while you aren't in every 50 states, you are in a lot of locations. So, I think you talked about, from very small to still small locations. Can you give that? Because I think that's, in terms of trying to really think about how companies, adjust to a pandemic, adjust strategies. I think that's probably added some challenges for you. So I think that'd be helpful to start with.
Sure, thanks for clarification. It's a very distributed employee base. So the majority of our people are working in clean room pharmacies. And so 80 plus locations throughout the United States is where these pharmacists and pharm techs come into work, compounding the drugs, delivery and warehouse people, shipping the drugs out to patients. We have billing center folks that historically had been coming into locations and facilities that overnight we enabled remote work. And so almost 100% of our billing organization moved remote within 4 weeks. We have corporate office, resources that, again, are typically resident in a corporate office facility that are now remote. But it's a very distributed model where some of our locations are as small as 10 people, and our largest facility has over 210 people in it. So it's a challenge as you think about communicating across the organization. Each location is somewhat different. So as we are responding to the pandemic, how each location and each geography has to respond specifically is a little bit modified. So it keeps us on our toes as we try to adapt to the ever-changing environment we're in right now.
Yeah, when you think about your largest location being 210 people in a 6,000 person company, that's that's a lot of locations, I guess,
It is a
80
lot of locations.
to keep up.
Absolutely.
So we'll delve into that a little bit in a second, but what I'd like to start with is, when you think about the strategic issues that you wrestled with, I think every business, in this pandemic has said, okay, here's one or two strategic issues. What would you say are the top one or two issues that you as an organization really, had to deal with, in obviously adjusting to the pandemic?
Yep. Well, I would tell you first and foremost that what we had to think about was how do we ensure that we keep our frontline patient-facing people safe, as well as how do we maintain our services while keeping our patients and the families that are typically around them safe. So making sure that we had all the PPE that we needed and making sure that the patients were adequately prepared and adequately protected as well. Again, most 85, almost 90% of the services we provide, we are going into patients' homes. And the variety of homes that we experience vary quite dramatically. So making sure everybody stays safe was first and foremost of critical importance there. And then it was how can we best provide those services when oftentimes we were not being admitted into the hospital setting. Oftentimes what we are doing is we are helping transfer patients who are in a hospital setting to the home. Okay. So we typically go in, we meet with the patients at the hospital, we help educate them on the infusion services, we prep them for that first time, and we help that transition from the hospital setting to home. Well, most of the hospitals were not allowing anybody in. And so it really challenged us on how could we make sure that we can transfer those patients effectively. And so we use technology. And so we very quickly enabled virtual teaches where the patients could, whether it's their iPhone or their iPad or other computer, we could access and we could provide virtual teaching and virtual transfer services to them so that we can help prepare them to get to the home when we can finally get to them. So that was probably the most immediate need that we had to make sure. Acquiring all the PPE when everybody and their brother was out there trying to buy masks and trying to buy protective equipment was a challenge at first. Fortunately, we have plenty of that on stock now. And so I would tell you, Keith, that's probably the first, second, and third top priority that we had when this whole thing broke out.
Because my guess is you probably couldn't have a pause in service. You couldn't have said, okay, let's stop for a month while we get it all ready in the business that you're in. So did you guys form a team, or, I mean, was it like everybody, or how did you guys kind of adjust to that kind of thing? Because it had to happen overnight.
Yeah, so I think one of the smartest things that we did is we formed a command center very quickly. And this command center is all the key decision makers across all the relevant functions within our clinical setting, within our operations setting, and others, so that we had all the decision makers on the phone at a minimum twice a week, going through whatever changes were happening. The CDC was changing their expectations and their requirements almost on a weekly basis. So making sure that we were staying up to date with the most relevant information and that we could make decisions quickly and then disseminate that information out to the location leaders was critical. We also set up a hotline so that any employee could call or email us with any type of question that they had. And that was manned almost 24 hours a day with, again, people in the clinical areas. I had several people on my HR team monitoring that as well, so that we could track our own employees and any occurrences or events or positives testing that happened within our own employees, but also answer questions that were coming up from people interacting with our patients on a regular basis.
Yeah, it sounds like though you probably had two things. One is what is the plan and strategy and communication, but also logistical. right? How do you get all the safety gear out to everyone? I mean, it
Yep.
just seems like something that had to, did you already have that set up pretty well, or do you guys have to adjust as well?
Well, we have a great procurement department that was able to access the critical information, or critical equipment that we needed. But then working with those 80 plus field location managers to make sure that we had the right amounts and it got to them in a timely manner, and that then they distributed it to the critical patient facing people they needed. Um, was a bit of a logistical challenge at first, but a great team, and we were able to get it done quickly. But as you said, the communication was equally as challenging, because in such a distributed business, making sure that all the frontline employees got the relevant information quickly was paramount. And so frequent communications in multiple media was important for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mean, we use the word at Guidespark a lot around change communications,
Yeah.
because you were talking about potentially weekly updates from the CDC and other requirements that you had to do, and I'm sure you had to then deal with local rules and local guidelines as well. Yeah, that's
Well, and as each state came up with their own particular spin on the federal requirements or the CDC, having to adapt to that. So one of the things that I think we did well is early on, we developed a list of situational guidelines. So we tried to imagine all the different types of situations that our employees would run across, or our location managers would run across, and provide them very specific guidelines for what to do when an employee presents that somebody who's been exposed to somebody who's positive. What should I do there? We had, if a courier or someone delivering a product to our location tested positive, what do we do there? Setting up cleaning protocols, setting up communication protocols. So we did that very quickly in order to provide as much information as we can to those frontline managers, because they're the ones day in and day out that are actually making it happen. We can provide input and direction from our virtual corporate office, but the frontline really is those location managers who are doing it day in and day out.
Yeah, we talked to a lot of organizations around agility and the ability to change quickly, and they always talk about the front line and the frontline managers, right? If you're going to move quickly, one message from the very top is not going to drive the kind of change. You really have to figure out a way to enable the people who are out there to make those changes.
Well, and then our senior leaders in each of the functional areas were also then holding weekly meetings with their broader teams. So we had the command center that was meeting twice a week, but then those senior leaders would take that information and disseminate it out to their local leaders at the various levels on a weekly basis as well. So a lot of communication that's going on, but I think that's what's helped us to kind of weather through this first round of everything.
Yeah, it's interesting, because when people talk about healthy and safe, I'm in a software company. Healthy and safe is not quite the same level of protocols that you've had to go through and had to deal with. I mean, it's amazing the kinds of things that companies have done. The second one you touched on a little bit was, the digital transformation around Teach. And, it's interesting because I think I talked to a lot of organizations who, had programs like this. You probably had that project already in process, or maybe, on a much slower ramp. Was there anything specific that you guys did to accelerate it, or was it kind of just everybody knew this was critical, and so they just were able to deliver it in, I'm sure a fraction of the time you had thought?
Yeah, it had always been something that we were looking to do to expand our capabilities and make our teams out in the field more efficient and effective. But yeah, it got quickly accelerated as soon as those hospitals closed their doors and we couldn't access them, and we realized talking to a patient over the phone just wasn't the way to do that. So we were able to leverage some other digital technologies we'd used in more static communication with patients, more educational tools. But our IT team, worked like crazy to get this in place. And within 4 weeks, we were up and running with a great version of our virtual Teach module, disseminated it out to all our nurses with their iPads and iPhones. so that we could deploy that pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I think about a lot is, a lot of organizations now realize what's possible, right? Your IT team can never say, hey, it's going to take me 6 months. It's like, well, you actually have done it in 4 weeks. So.
Well, and Keith, we had the same situation and realization with all the remote work and work from home. And for years it was, well, no, people need to come into the offices because that's where either the equipment is, or that's where the reporting is, or the relationships. And again, I'll go back to our billing center. We have almost 800 people involved in one way or the other with our billing centers and our reimbursement centers. And in 4 weeks, we went to 96% of that population going virtual and working from home. And our productivity actually increased. And through pulse surveys with that population, their satisfaction went up.
Wow.
And they were very appreciative of how responsive we were able to be. So pre-COVID, across the entire 6,000 person population, we were about 40% remote work enabled. Today, we're over 70% remote work enabled in this relatively short period of time. Now, I will say, not everybody who is 100% remote wants to stay 100% remote. I think while they enjoy the flexibility, as soon as we think it's appropriate, we'll start staggering people back in the offices to the degree that they would like, but it will never be what it was before. We've recently announced in several of our locations, as soon as the leases are up in these locations, these buildings, we're not going to re-up the lease. And so those people will be working permanently, remotely or from home. Again, I think that will become part of the new normal as we think about work arrangements.
So when you think about that, as you think about, what I'll call it kind of the people model, or, however the talent model, or all of those things, I'm sure, you're still in the process of trying to think about what's going to happen over the next year or two. But what are some of the things that are top of mind for you as you think about, again, moving to something where there is no office where there used to be an office? How do you manage performance, or any of those kind of things? What are the couple of things that are top of mind for you?
Well, for me, Keith, the things I worry about, and we're still figuring out, so we don't have the answers to all of this yet, is that onboarding time with new employees is so critical to make the connection with the culture, to make the connection with their manager, to make sure that they've got the right education and information and training to do their job well very quickly. That onboarding now being virtual in many situations, we just have to take that up another level to make sure that there is a connection with the employee on a more frequent basis. So we're encouraging our managers to communicate more frequently now that their teams are remote. At a minimum, on a weekly basis, we want our managers to be connecting with their employees, even if it's for 2, 3, 4 minutes. It may not be a long one-on-one session, but just make a personal outreach and connection with people, because those early days of a new hire, I think, are critical. I think the other question mark that I know other colleagues of mine in the HR space are still thinking about is the whole concept of culture. And particularly for organizations that have always been somewhat of an office-based organization where people are interacting on a regular basis. So for example, in our locations, in our 80+ locations, almost every single location, the very first thing they do in the morning is they have a huddle meeting of all the key employees to talk about the patients, to talk about key issues. And it's that quick 15-minute huddle in the morning that connects people with priorities, but it also connects people interpersonally and culturally within that dynamic. That's all gone, or that's all either over virtual chats like you and I are doing right now, and it loses a little bit. So what an organization's culture is going to look like, and what leaders need to do to embed that culture and to reinforce that culture to stay connected with their people, that I think is one of the bigger challenges that we're facing right now.
Yeah, you touched on kind of onboarding that I think has cultural aspects, and then you talked about culture in general. the way people create workspaces influence culture, right? Is it open? Where are the shared locations? And there's been a big trend over, certainly here in California, over much more open spaces to kind of drive a more collaborative culture. And then all of a sudden, you're hit with all remote workers, and that bond, that connection, whether it's even that employee manager, right? They may have a coffee in the break room that is no longer there, all the way to the collaborative space. And so it's really going to be interesting to see, how do you build connection in a more remote environment? I mean, that's the $1 million question. So first I'll ask you, you got one or two suggestions for how to do that?
Well, yeah. So like I said, I think first and foremost, it's about frequency. It really is. It's about making sure that there are regular connections with people, just to check in, just to ask them how they're doing, what's going on with the family. It may not need to be work related. And in fact, I think that's, one of the, traditional norms of management has always been keep it professional, focus on work. And I think that's going out the door. I think the future is going to be about connecting with the whole person and finding out what's going on with them, and showing that you're interested in life outside of this, because they have to deal with that now in these settings and working remotely. So frequency is critical. I think the other thing that is going to be critical for companies is to figure out, to the extent possible, and it's not possible for all jobs, are there more objective metrics around getting work done? I think it is going to challenge those managers who, believe that unless that my employee sees me watching them, or unless I see them in the office doing something, their productivity is not going to be strong. It's really going to be difficult for those types of managers versus managers who are clearly defining, here's the output, here's what's expected of you from a deliverable, and I'll be able to track your ability to deliver on that. And so if you're able to do that, I'm assuming you're doing all that you need to do. And this idea that I need to check in on you or make sure that you're truly working, it's going to require managers to be more focused on the deliverables and the results, I think. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Certainly, as you've outlined, though, a challenge, right? The manager training and how you do that is not, that's not where the core has been. And but I did want to touch a little bit on, what you touched on, the first thing about the frequency of connection, and I think there's a blending of professional and personal lives that certainly is so real when you're working, you're working at home, right? Whether it's kids or whatever it is, it's like that blend. And I think the way you talked about it is where that's going to have to stay in order to build some of that connection, right? Because you don't get some of the interaction that you might have gotten. But I also look at tools like, when I think about video, I used to think of it as a very formal thing. Like, if I was going to do a video, I was going to go present online, or I was going to do something. Whereas now for us, we've made it kind of a default, because you have to do that. And, you read about Zoom fatigue and all that stuff, but you're going to have to balance it, because I think the things that used to be formal, can't just be for formal if you're in this kind of culture.
Keith, I completely agree with you, and making it okay occasionally that I'm showing up at 7:30 in the morning without the video camera on, because maybe it's taken me a little while to get ready for that. But the other thing, I think, back to your comment about formality and informality, we encourage our leaders to send videos to their team, very short, brief, quick update videos. And to make it very simple and informal, and take your phone and just, kind of do a selfie video. People appreciate that. People don't need a highly produced video that's going out. And so, again, to your point, what used to be viewed as a more formal medium, I think is now a very casual one. It can be a very casual one. And the good news is, I think the technology is advancing nicely such that it's also very easy to use. And so it's very quick, easy, put up a virtual meeting and go. And I do think that connection is also critical to be on video. Conference calls where you can't see anybody, when I can't see facial expressions, when you're not looking and making virtual eye contact with somebody, you know, back at the end of the day, we're still humans, right? And we need that interaction and we need that social dynamic. And so at some point, connecting with your employees via video, if you have to be remote, I think is important just to experience and share with the complete person as opposed to just listening to them over the phone.
Yeah. Now, you know, one of the things that you've mentioned a little bit around communications is, you know, the leadership on down, you know, the managers and all of that stuff. And so obviously, you know, there's some level of cascade, there's some level. Is there a strategy that you guys, I mean, because you are an extreme with 80 locations, how do you think about kind of the strategy of depending on what the program or the communication is, right? Because you can't do everything the same way.
Right. So we actually kind of think about it in different types of tiers and the kind of information. And then the different channels, communication channels that we have. So like most companies, there's traditional email that we use. And typically for more corporate common messages that are going out to all employees, from our CEO, from me, from our COO, we'll either use a broad email blast out to individuals. So we're not relying on cascading. So we make sure it goes to every single, every one of the 6,000 employees that we have from that perspective. Then there are, by functional areas, the functional leaders will have separate meetings, separate calls, and typically those are just conference calls with individuals taking it down to the next level. We've also, though, expanded our technology and have gotten into more of the type of social dynamic with our communication. So we've launched a communication app across the organization, a very simple tool, but it allows groups of people to create what's called their own communities. And so if I have a bunch of pharmacists who just in the Northeast who want to create a community of Northeast pharmacists, they can do that because issues that they're dealing with in the Northeast may be different than what pharmacists in the West are dealing with. Or again, a functional area. So my HR team has a community. So when we want to just talk and share within our own HR world, we can do that. So we've set that up at this point now. I believe the last count, we have over 50 different communities across the organization. We don't track that. We allow people to set that up as they will. But we also then use that tool for broadcast messages. And we find that multiple mediums, either an email or something I can access on my phone through this app, gets better penetration with the organization there. So we think about the different types of messages. We also think about how frequent. We're also very cautious about fatigue on the types of communication that's going out, and being respectful that people have a day job and their whole job isn't just to, you know, read communications that are coming out. So we need to make sure it's relevant. We pace it out. We don't overburden people with too much email throughout the week.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hear a lot of parallels to what happens in our consumer lives. You know, you've talked about selfie videos by leaders. You're talking about shared communities that allow people to just share in an ad hoc basis, and you know, and then, you know, certainly different vehicles and formats. And I think what it is you know, what I think about a lot is how do you start to create much more personalized experiences for your different groups? Yep. Because I think traditionally it was always this one size fits all. And what you've done is you have certain one size fits all, but then you have these other experiences, whether they're more ad hoc through a shared social community, or they are, you know, cascaded or grouped by division or role. And I think that mixture is really how organizations are going to be able to continue to move quickly, you know, as this world changes and you know, gets more remote.
And I totally agree with you, Keith. And I think another learning, and I would say this is from the last several companies that I've been a part of, and particularly within a healthcare space, you do have to be very careful about what gets communicated. There is, you know, PHI information around patients and the like that we have to be very confidential and sensitive with. So what gets communicated across the various mediums is a very important issue for us. But what I'll also say, if you set up the basic parameters and the purpose of the tools, and provide some basic infrastructure or architecture to that, you can then let the employees kind of go with that and create, and as you said, personalize that to what best suits their needs. And they do a great job with it, and you don't have to sit around and monitor your the communication traffic at all. It just really has worked exceptionally well. And what's been fun is to see the nuances and the unique approaches that certain people take, and then how quickly other people are shamelessly stealing that approach and applying it to their groups because it's a better idea. So it's fun to see that dynamic also play out within the organization.
Okay. Now, I think a session like today cannot be done without at least touching on the racial tensions. And I think, as you talk about, some of the things you said about, setting guidelines, setting guidelines for some things are more controllable. This is obviously an issue that has lots of different perspectives and lots of different impact. How's this affected your business and how you thought about, some of the things that you do as an organization and how you try to set guidelines for your employees? Because, in this case, what I've learned, even in a small company, you have a range of perspectives.
You do, absolutely. And, it has really been, a challenge, and it's been a time to really step back and be more introspective about, let's look at our environment, let's look at our workplace, and what's working well and what's not, and being, open to and being brutally honest with yourselves and the rest of the organization about what that needs to look like. Keith, we have communicated internally within our organization about how horrible the situation has been, how senseless these killings have been, and it's also made us think about what we are doing and maybe what we're not doing as an organization to be more inclusive within our organization. And we're starting to take steps to better listen and understand what that is. Regarding the multitude of perspectives on this, there's some things I think you can control, and then there's just some things you can't. Our CEO, sent a very nice message to the organization. One of our employees didn't necessarily agree completely with the message, took that message, put it on their Facebook's public site, and made their own comments. Everybody has a right to their own opinion. Everybody has a right to their own perspective on that. And we've spent a lot less time monitoring and providing guidelines for any of that. And frankly, what we're trying to do is just create an environment where people feel comfortable sharing their opinions. We think that's probably the best indicator of if we're making progress in our culture, is if people feel comfortable sharing their opinions, good or, supportive of or not supportive of a particular position with a senior leader on that. This is just early days on this, and I think clearly, as candid, as genuine as leaders can be, that is critical, because otherwise employees will sense that this is just company leaders being opportunistic, being superficial, and that can't be what we do with this if we're really going to see change that happens not only in our organizations, but in our communities as well.
Yeah, I think that's, one interesting takeaway that I've certainly seen, which is, the more openness for a variety of perspectives. And it's interesting because you think about diversity, right? Diversity is part of, why do companies think it's important? I think it's important for business because you get a variety of perspectives.
Yep.
And yet, in many of these kinds of issues, the perspectives have not been as shared. And I think hopefully this trend, will not only just, help some of these issues that need to change and evolve, but also just for businesses, and then the importance of how can these businesses, impact the blending of personal and professional lives, but also the business side, right? Like I think they were somewhat separate, and so you're seeing blending. I mean, it seems like it's been a theme, whether it's been an issue like this or some of the other things you've been doing about that blending.
Well, and we've seen that there's, it's not a work life and then a personal life, and your personal life blends into your work life, and your work life blends into your home and your personal life. So this idea that between 8 and 5, I put my personal life aside is ridiculous. And so, as in these huddle meetings that I talked about, the issue of systemic racism has come up in discussions within our workplace, and we want to make sure it's a constructive opportunity for people to discuss it. But again, it's not something that just happens when you go home, and making sure that our workplace supports the communication, the dialogue, the learning of that is key, because we have to deal with the whole person. I think, again, one of those paradigms that I think has really shifted over the years around the role of work and the role of the company plays in helping to support the entire well-being of our employees, their financial well-being, obviously through employment, but their social well-being, their emotional well-being, their physical well-being. You can't separate that, I think, nowadays with the people that are walking in your door, providing great care to your patients, because, that's, particularly as a service company, that's what we provide, is that exceptional service coming from an individual. And so we need to make sure that we're being respectful of all aspects of that.
Yeah. We could go off on a whole topic around the challenges of well-being, I think, as we think about what this people model and organization is going to be, because, you mentioned the breadth of that, right? There's been a tremendous amount of stuff around mental health now, right? The isolation from the remote. There's a lot of positives around it, but it's very few times is everything 100% positive, and you have to deal with these things that weren't top of mind.
Yeah, well, and you just touched on a topic there, Keith, that I think is going to be critical over the next several years. And colleagues of mine, as they're looking at their benefit plan offerings and the like, but mental health and mental well-being and those services that organizations provide and support, I think, are going to be critical. Because not only we had people dealing with just the stress of the pandemic, add on to it all the other issues and challenges and stresses with all the social upheaval with that. It's a very challenging situation. Unfortunately, you see the occurrence of domestic violence and child abuse going up with the pandemic. And so, again, I think companies are going to have to think about that mental well-being of their employees a lot more, I think, than they probably did in the last several years.
Yeah. Mike, we could probably go on for a long time talking about a lot of these types of issues, but for me, I wanted to just kind of finish it up just to get a couple of your thoughts around, the future. It's when you think about what is the biggest thing that you want to hope to solve as you move forward for your organization, what is it? Is it one of the topics we've talked about?
I think it is around this whole idea of connection and culture. I think what the workplace and that workplace experience is going to be going forward has forever changed. I think a lot of companies are just realizing that they're not going to go back to what they were before. But then how do I create that unique culture? Because I think that's what is so oftentimes the differentiator for companies. People have similar products, they deliver similar services, but it's that culture that creates that unique, differentiated experience that attracts and keeps great people in the organization. And I think now it's going to challenge us to think about, how do we do that virtually? How do we do that through different types of medium? And how do we skill our managers in order to be more effective in this new world? So that to me, if I had to boil it all down to what's the thing that's going to keep me up at night, it's probably that.
How about then, to finish off, what's one recommendation that you give to your colleagues as you think about, the next year or two? Like, what would you say is the thing that you would, recommend for people to do?
I think what I would recommend is constantly stay in touch with your frontline managers. They are the ones who are going to see the changes first. They're the ones who actually have to implement. They're the ones where that frontline engagement happens, and making sure that you are connected, have a good pipeline into and a good two-way communication with those frontline managers in order to react to what's happening quickly. If you've got strong connections there, I think you're in great shape.
Okay. Well, Mike, this has been fantastic. Connection and culture and managers, like, I think those are key messages for all of us to think about as we move forward. So Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.